All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the effect of our communication style. So last week, or to start off the course, I had you look at different personality tests, evaluate your communication style, even just look at your Myers-Briggs, whether or not you think there's a lot of value in that personally, whether you believe in it personally, is less to the point and more for you to get a sense, especially if you've never engaged with any of that material before, of what kind of communicator you are. How do you show up in the world? What do you think of yourself? How do other people perceive you? And you may have a really good sense of that already. The tests may not have told you anything you didn't already know. But my hope is that at least in one of those evaluations, or possibly in all of them, you got some sense of what your style is. And why do I want you to do that? Well, before we move into a whole quarter-long conversation on patient communication and really using our communication style and our communication knowledge and strategy to build patient relationships and most importantly, to improve outcomes. And what we have to understand is that our style of communication, our personal style of communication, our personalities to that effect, actually affect patient outcomes. It's not necessarily to say that all the power is in our hands, but we do actually have that power. And we want to make sure that we're wielding that power in a really just way, and to make sure that we are utilizing that power for the higher good of our patients that we serve. Ultimately, our oaths, and I also, personally, professionally believe that we are in service to the people that we care for in our settings. And one of the skills we have is our communication style. And for a lot of us, we could work on it. We can always work on it. It is ultimately a lifelong pursuit. And the first piece is really just being reflective of that process. So let's move on. Why does it matter? Well, I just talked to you a little bit about that, but why does your particular style matter? And really, what are the direct implications? And I want you to understand this in terms of how it's actually been studied. So there have been a number of reviews, and I mean, if you were to Google this topic, communication style and patient care outcomes, and put that into a Google search box, you will get hundreds and hundreds of links to articles and blogs, and in addition to peer-reviewed journal articles. So there is a lot out there that ties these two things together, and that in and of itself might be enough for you to understand, oh wow, I have a tremendous amount of impact in the way that I walk into that room every single day. If I walk in poorly rested, undercaffeinated, underfed, overly stressed, and my stuff isn't checked at that door, it is absolutely going to affect my communication style. And it is absolutely going to affect the outcomes for that patient that day. It's not just your experience. It's not just how you feel that day. So there are a lot of reasons why in mental health settings, behavioral health settings, counseling in general, and especially in this sort of intensive patient care that a lot of us deliver, why people talk about, like, check your baggage at the door, leave your stuff at home. There are real reasons why those sayings are sayings, why they matter, and this is part of what happens. So why do institutions care? Well, ultimately, negative patient outcomes absolutely equate across the board with higher healthcare costs. That's for the institutions, so institutions that many of us work for. We will incur those costs. How does that affect you? Well, if your institution is incurring higher costs because of negative patient outcomes, how does that trickle down through to the people who work for that institution, to the people who are served by that institution, and then also, to the taxpayers that surround that institution? Well, if there's less money in the coffers, there's less money for raises, promotions, continuing education that actually helps promote positive patient interactions and pedagogy or learning that allows us to be better care providers. There are a lot of ways that this has direct impacts on you and your progression professionally, right? That's one way to think of it. Another piece is patient outcomes. I mean, again, if we're all in service to the people that we say we're in service to, we don't want them to suffer because of something that was ultimately possibly preventable on our end. And in the third or the third consideration here is, how does this trickle all the way out into the communities? Well, I mean, healthcare isn't free in our country. And we can have a myriad of discussions on that. And that's not the purpose of bringing this up. The purpose is that Medicaid and Medicare, for all intents and purposes, are taxpayer subsidized programs. And the more often that our patients who are served by Medicaid and Medicare actually show up in, say, emergency rooms for things that could have been prevented in that initial interaction in the office or in the treatment room, that incurs higher costs for the system of Medicaid and Medicare, and where those costs gets translated is out through taxpayers. So it is not wholly the fault of people who are using those services. It is also partly our responsibility, I won't say fault, our responsibility to contribute as positively as is possible, such that our patients aren't then leaving our room, misunderstanding what we said and ending up back in the ED 2 days later, not because we didn't convey the information that was necessary, but we didn't convey in a way that the person could hear, that the person trusted, that was relatable, and not just understood intellectually, but like they got it. You know, it made sense to them in terms of their healthcare outcomes. So take a moment to read over this slide on your own time. I'm not going to read it to you, but I want to give you the nuts and bolts of what it actually says. Patient communication is bidirectional, right? We're used to receiving a lot of information, but in the interest of time, maybe cutting them off, keeping it concise, directing our questions in a certain way. And a lot of that is also handed down to us. So I also understand that sometimes you are directed to cut people off, to not spend so much time with them, to ask only certain questions because, asking about their dog or letting them know that they look great today. Or, you like that shirt that they're wearing. Sounds superficial. And maybe you've directed like, hey, cut the chit chat. Don't ask those kinds of questions. But what we'll find out as we move through the quarters, those are actually things that build trust in seconds. They're really small things that we can do that will absolutely change the tenor of the conversation and also whether or not that patient receives what you're about to tell them, such that it is not enough to talk to them about the side effects of the drug they're taking if you haven't actually made that connection. But we'll get to some of that later in the quarter. But what you need to know is that it's bidirectional, right? That there is something that you are not just receiving their communication. You're not just receiving their information, noting it down, putting it in a chart, and making a diagnosis. There is something that you are also giving in that exchange. And that's a really important piece to communication that actually improves patient outcomes. It has to be bidirectional. We have to give and receive. We'll get to the burnout piece a little bit later because there is some parts of like where we take so much that it feels incredibly unidirectional. And so we'll get to that as well. Not only in this upcoming module, but also further along in the course. You also have to be able to understand and interpret the information. So sometimes one of the major hangups for why patients don't really understand what we're telling them or understand the severity is because we don't always understand that. And that's not lack of intelligence or intellectual capability, but sometimes there isn't just the time, or that the people who are directing us don't always make it important that we do. And so that is, if anything else, I apologize. I'm also homeschooling and have lots of dogs, so you're going to hear them over the course of the quarter. So that really, to me, tells us that in order to be great communicators, we have to be learners. Even if we don't consider ourselves quote unquote intellectual or smart people, learning is not only in the hands of people who get great grades, or only in the hands of people who go and pursue school up through their doctorate levels. And I say this as a person who spent a lot of time in school. Learning is something that we all are engaged in, and it's really about curiosity. So being curious, not only about our patients, but about the information we're giving them is a really important part of conveying that information to them, because they are going to have questions. They are going to be curious. And in order for us to convey that information in a way that impacts them, not just like it hits their brain or their ears, but like really gets in there, seeps in, and they understand it. It's a difference between intent and impact. is to understand all of that. We have to understand that we have a role, that our patients' understanding of things is not solely their responsibility, that they have to be able to trust us, and that we have to actually be learners ourselves in order for our patients to then have that same curiosity and same learning about their health. So overall, when we're looking at like that healthcare cost thing and the trickle-down model, what we see is that ineffective communication is one of the #1 reasons why patients end up in the ED for stuff that was totally preventable, increasing costs, but also increasing the level of intervention for that patient, potentially really traumatic experiences. So if that person that has a psychotic episode as a side effect of that medication, they didn't fully understand other things that they were utilizing, like substances, and the implications for that. So you guys would have talked a lot about that in your previous class. Then they show up in the ED. There's a lot of other things that now happen in terms of the cascade of interventions to this person that were ultimately preventable, not solely by you. So I'd also want to be really clear, this is wholly not your responsibility and fault, but just that we have some level of responsibility in this. And one of the most common reasons is that patients don't fully understand the implications of the medications they're taking, not just the list of side effects. It's not a literacy issue. It's not like, you know, the fast voice on the drug commercials issue. But they don't really fully understand the things that they're experiencing are actually a result of the medication. Again, when we're just rattling off information and we got a limited amount of time, how can we get them to understand that? We will definitely get to that, but some of it is those little shorthands that I talked to you about. It's like, God, if you ask them about their dog, would they have understood the side effects better? That sounds crazy, but it's actually not. It actually makes a difference, a measurable difference in terms of whether or not people understand those things, because it's that they choose to hear you and they choose to listen. The other place where common misunderstandings happen is in that whole history of the presenting illness and the timeline, because we are not understanding the timeline properly, because we know this. A lot of our patients, they're coming in worried, scared, distressed, actively ill. Their own timeline is jumbled for them. I mean, think about how we tell stories. When our executive functioning, our prefrontal cortex is flooded because we are stressed, worried, anxious, and or experiencing acute stress or distress from our illness. We can't remember things that happened 5 seconds ago. We can't even remember why we walked in a room, let alone the timeline of something that may have been going on for 4 to 6 weeks. So a lot of times, some of the shorthands here are really just helping the patient to slow down a little bit and say, all right, take me back to something you were doing 4 to 6 weeks ago. That would have been the end of February. All right, so that was around President's Day weekend. You know, do you have kids? Maybe you're on midwinter break. What could you have been doing around that time? You take a few seconds, and we're talking about, just to say that was what, 30 seconds? A few seconds to actually help them anchor back into the origination of that timeline and then walk you forward. And that right there, that little piece of connecting to their personal life can help you also get the information you need from a clinical perspective. So what about providers? So this is where I want to talk a little bit about how this impacts you. What does your unique style tell you? I want you to understand why I had you take those tests. I want you to understand what your bias is. That's really critical in everything that we're going to talk about in the course of this quarter. But your style has a lot to do with whether or not patients hear you, truly understand or are impacted by you, and comply with the recommendations that you and your team are making. So I want you to think about times that you were misunderstood. And you know you were misunderstood. And I'm not talking about like language barriers or someone who is acutely under the influence of substances and there is something affecting their ability to actually communicate with you in that moment. I want you to think about where you were having a one-on-one with this person. You know you said a certain thing, but they came back and understood something completely different. I mean, I've been a clinician and been in healthcare for over 20 years. And I spend a lot of time in connection with my patients. This is the kind of care that I specialize in or deliver. Part of it is that I have more time, and I do that on purpose. And even with that time, I can spend 45 minutes with a person and they still walk out not having understood what I said. there's a disconnect. And that is not a fault of yours. That is not just, to denigrate anything that you're doing in your interactions, but that we just didn't make it. We didn't do it right. I know this as an instructor. I say things a million different ways, and it lands for some of you. It'll land for some of you, and then there'll be a couple people who are like, what the heck was she talking about? That is neither the fault of the person receiving it and not inherently my fault, but it is something for me to learn from and something for me to adjust. So when people have misunderstood you, what were the implications? And I want you to think of those scenarios, and I want you to be self-reflective. This is not about being punitive. It's not about beating yourself up about like, oh, I should have done that better, blah, blah, blah. Yes, we should have done it better. And what are you going to do about it? And that's honestly the thing I want us to take into this quarter. What are you going to do about it? What little shorthands can we start to weave into our communication styles when you are working in really tight settings and in some situations really unsafe settings to neutralize a situation or to actually even improve it? It happens to everyone. Literally every single clinician who's been in this game long enough will tell you that you will be misunderstood. And it is not about like blowing it off and saying, but people are going to misunderstand me. That's their problem. That's not it either. It is partly our problem, and we as curious learners can grow from that. And so that's what I'm asking you to engage in over the course of this quarter is, what can you learn from this? So in evaluating your style, you might find out that like, oh, I'm actually a super introverted, if you take the Myers-Briggs, I'm a super introverted, super judgmental person. That is not a judgment of you. That is more so like, okay, I understand that that's my underlying way of being. So I might have to work a little harder in my patient interactions to be more outside of myself, to connect with people outside of myself instead of expecting them to connect with me. I might have to check myself a lot more often when I'm hearing people tell something. Watch for my knee-jerk reaction. Oh, this person told me that they just drank 5 beers yesterday. Oh, and they're on this medication. Why are they doing that? Immediately that has colored your interaction, the rest of your interaction with that patient. These are natural things that happen. I'm not asking you to change your personality. What I'm asking you to do is to witness it and understand how it's actually affecting that patient in that interaction, but also their long-term outcomes, how those outcomes affect healthcare costs, and how it really feeds into our larger system. That's big stuff. So yes, the personality test might seem really superficial, but the purpose is really to start connecting you to all these other dots that come after. Your style also impacts your own well-being, right? So let's come back to the example of someone who is more introverted. That's a lot of work to be an extroverted work. I am clearly a much more extroverted person. I like my time alone to recharge, but I definitely get energy from my interactions with people. For a lot of people, it is incredibly draining and sapping. And if you're working with a population of people that is very high needs, that is maybe highly addicted, and people who are experiencing a lot of trauma, and you're experiencing that vicarious trauma, and I have done a lot of that work when I worked more in the public health sector. And even honestly in perinatal health, it absolutely contributes to your burnout, and I have been there too. So there are ways for us to understand also with our personality types or our communication styles where we give a lot, where we subvert ourselves to be great clinicians in those situations, and where we may need to do a lot more work on the back end to fill back up after we give like that. And I will say it is potentially more challenging for people who are more introverted to do that work in the moment. But on the flip side, more introverted, naturally introverted people might have a really great working system to fill back up on the back end. Extroverted people might thrive in those patient interactions, but I will speak from personal professional experience that we might not be so good at filling back up on the back end. So there are pros and cons to both, right? Neither is a better thing for healthcare. And these are also experiences that when we talk a little bit about personal disclosure and boundaries later in the quarter, can be ways that we can connect with patients too. The bottom line is your communication style can also impact your job satisfaction. Because who doesn't want better patient outcomes? Who doesn't want happier patients, well patients. I think that we all do if we got into this work. We all want our patients to be well because then our communities are well. And then we are well because we are living in a more well community. So this is all not even bi-directional, but multi-directional. But also having better connections with people improves our job satisfaction. And this is true for introverted or extroverted people. Introverted people might need fewer connections than extroverted people, but having connection, human connection, and I think we have witnessed this more than ever in this last year with the pandemic, improves our satisfaction in life. And very distinctly in job satisfaction. So there's also a lot of research to support this. It decreases the level of burnout, of staff turnover. And so think about how that has affected you in terms of your floors and your units and people coming and going all the time, where you get someone who's onboarded, part of the team, and then they leave. And a lot of times it's those really good ones, right? Because they're the ones who care. And then doing the work for a certain amount of time for people who are really, really struggling, they're impacted. It hurts to care for people who are hurting. Then there's also greater institutional satisfaction, because when patients have better outcomes and healthcare costs are down, institutions are happier and they treat the people who work for them better. So there's lots of ways that this trickles down and trickles back up. What is also most notable here is that patients fare better and they rate their care more highly when people who work there are happier. And this is a really fascinating thing in the research that shows up that patients feel like they got better care, they're more compliant, and their outcomes are better when their providers are happy. That's crazy. Think about how much our own contentment affects the people that we care for. It feels big, like that's a really big responsibility, but also think how impactful it is that even if we take micro steps from where we are right now, we add 1 or 2 skills or strategies to our quiver in the course of the next few months. We can make measurable differences with every single patient that we see. We can make, therefore, measurable differences in our community health just by adding a couple of extra skills. I think that's pretty cool. So here is a slide I'm not going to read to you about best practices. And some of this is mirrored in the video about motivational interviewing. The concepts are almost identical. You want to prepare for that interaction. So whatever that is, you do a thing before you walk in the room. You come up with a little time-sensitive ritual. You listen intently and completely, meaning you're not cutting them off. And you and the patients are in agreement, right? Because sometimes your agenda, getting through the visit, getting everything noted in the chart, getting everything checked off, is not their agenda. And that is one of the fundamental disconnects and why things progress as they do in that patient's healthcare. You connect with their story. Ask about their dog, their cat, their kid, that blue shirt that they're wearing, and it has, I don't know, some saying on it. What does that mean to you? Oh, it's just something that someone gave me. Okay, cool. Who was that person? And also looking for body language. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail as we go, but people give you a lot of cues in their body language. Some of this changes, again, when we're working with populations that are highly addicted or currently under the influence of substances. Mannerisms and body movements can change quite a bit, and so cues might be slightly different, but there are some generalizations, even in those situations, that we can utilize to understand whether or not this person feels really guarded and unsafe with you, or a lot more open. And they will tell you a lot about that. Looking for different cues in their eyes. And I think it's good to experiment with yourself. Just start to notice how you hold your body in certain situations and maintain eye contact or not. And what situations start to raise your hackles a little bit or not. That will also give you really good insight into how your body language and mannerisms affect other people. So there's a whole concept of mirroring in counseling and psychology. The idea that patients start to then mirror our body language, which isn't, again, to make you completely self-conscious about people watching your body. But there is something to that too, that we can also change the body language and the feel, the dynamic in the room by adjusting our own body language. So there's some cool stuff there, some little shorthands that I'll give you when we get to that particular piece in the quarter or in this course. Here are some references, some articles, as well as some websites or blogs for you guys to look at if you want to read a little bit more about some of these concepts. We will definitely dig into all of this in a lot more detail, but I want to make sure you guys understand, why are we doing this? Why are we starting off this way? Because we are going to dig in really in our next module into things related to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So some big stuff is going to come up in the coming weeks related to patient care, but also it can bring up a lot of stuff for us as providers in terms of traumatic experiences or stressful experiences we've had in our personal lives as well as our professional lives. And so I just want you to have an idea of how you operate before we get there. All right. If you guys have any questions at all, you need anything from me, I am always happy and available to have these conversations as we move forward, especially as I mentioned in my introduction, some of this stuff really, it dredges a lot of things up. I am asking you to be very self-reflective and incisive in the course of this quarter, and it can bring stuff up. So you are welcome to reach out to me at any point, and I fully expect that that might be true for some of you and that you may need support in it. And I want you to know that that is part of my role here. Is not just conveying information, but also that I'm here as a supportive person to you in this process. My intention is not to just dredge and drop. My intention is that we do this thing together in partnership. All right, take care. That's all for now, and I'll see you with the next installment. Bye.